Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, a global futures and deep futures advisory organization working up to 50 years out. So I cross over 600 emerging technologies. I've written 15 books on the future, which are all available to you for free. I cover hundreds of different megatrends, and I work with royal families around the world. I work with G7, G20 and G77 world leaders, and I also work with the world's largest organizations, companies like Microsoft, Google, Aon, Visa, Samsung, Huawei, and many, many more, to help them understand what the future could look like and then help them develop the visions and strategies to prosper in said future. Now, in this particular presentation, which I gave to the Haribo senior leadership team in Istanbul a little while ago, one of the things we actually covered basically was how do you actually make sense of an uncertain world to make sure that the vision and the strategies that your companies are putting together today and the execution strategies that you're putting together maybe tomorrow actually line up with your core markets and your objectives. So in this particular presentation, we're going to be going through everything that you as a senior leadership team need to ensure basically that the future is something that you shape rather than being something that runs you over. So this is the agenda that I put together for the SLT. Now, we're going to go through a little bit of an introduction. We're going to look at blunders as standard, which actually happens to even the world's largest organizations. We're going to look at how we silence the noise, because when we actually have a look at today's markets, most organizations are distracted by the headlines when really they should be following the trend lines, and we'll sort of dig into that. I'm going to be looking at how you as an organization can handle unexpected wildcards. Then we're going to be having a look at how we try to seek out certainty in an uncertain world. So I have a couple of strategies that I use with all of my clients. And then we're going to finally have a look at leadership. Now, when we think about the important points that I want to get across to you throughout this presentation, I want you to really sort of think about these. So firstly, the pace of change is accelerating. As an SLT, really you need to try to gain clarity on the things that are actually happening, but you also need to be insanely curious. Not just curious, but insanely curious. We also need to recognize that the level of complexity in the world, whether it is geopolitical, technological, and so on and so forth, even societal, is increasing, and that is its own challenge for a variety of reasons that we'll go through. But also, you have too many opportunities. A lot of organizations look at the world today by saying they just see threats. Same with individuals, same with professionals. I say we just see threats. However, every single threat to your organization is an opportunity to turn that threat into a threat that you can then weaponize basically against your own competitors. Because if it's a threat to you, it's a threat to your competitors, more than likely than not. So every threat is an opportunity, broadly, but also every opportunity is an opportunity. So if you know what your goals are, if you're an organization with the right culture, the right mindset, and that's very important, we dig into that in a little bit later, then actually one of your greatest problems is you have too many opportunities, which is nice. Now, increasingly, we're living in what we call the VUCA-MAX world. So VUCA basically was a phrase that was coined basically in the 1970s by the United States military to describe the future that they saw for the country. Now, it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, we've recently added this MAX acronym to the back of this. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of the changes that we're seeing are massive. They are system level. They are global in nature. Think how the environment is changing around the world, or the climate is changing around the world. It's a global change. Think about how geopolitics, we're now entering into a bipolar, multipolar era of geopolitics. That is a global change. When we think about economics, increasingly we start seeing de-dollarization taking a little bit of a bite, but we also see continental blocks, basically like Europe, BRICS 2.0 and so forth, actually creating their own currencies and actually thinking about the global economy in a very different way than we did a couple of years ago. Everything is also accelerating. So when we actually look at the pace of change around us, I'll go into this in a little bit, we can change the world in under a second. And when we think about exponential, we typically tend to think about exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, and all these kinds of other things. But the fact of the matter is, if you're starting a company today, you can use artificial intelligence as a one-man band to create a virtual agentic AI team for yourself, and you can now build products and scale into markets faster than you ever could before. So the pace of disruption, whether it be industry disruption or whether it be societal disruption with, for example, new opinions and misinformation appearing on social media, is now also increasingly exponential. So this is the phrase that we're going to be using moving forward. Now, when we think about disruption, nobody is immune from disruption. If you step back 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the vast majority of senior leadership teams basically would sort of sit around a table and say, when we're thinking about a new market opportunity or when we're thinking about disruption, what would Fatbag do? What would Facebook, Amazon, Tencent maybe, Alibaba, Google do, etc., etc. And increasingly today, these very, very large multi-trillion-dollar companies are the ones who are actually also facing disruption. So, for example, Amazon, which was generally seen as the unassailable e-commerce giant of the world, is being disrupted by agentic commerce. You can go into ChatGPT, you can search for products, it makes recommendations, and you can buy everything that you want to basically in the ChatGPT interface. So agentic commerce fundamentally disintermediates Amazon from you, the customer. But in addition to that, when we have a look at super apps, basically like, for example, TikTok, Temu, which we all know and love to different degrees, so it went from $0 in revenue to $50 billion in revenue in a 3-year period because they switched channels. They moved from a web or app-based interface to to being embedded in TikTok, in a super app. So Amazon is facing its own set of disruptions, and they're doing different things. They're building out agentic commerce for themselves, etc., with Amazon Buy Now. But nevertheless, if you step back 5 years ago or 10 years ago and you said, I have a way to disrupt Amazon, the vast majority of people would be saying they're unassailable. They're the brand leader by far. Now, when we think about Google basically within the space of 18 months basically saw its core search engine business, which is a $64 billion business, principally based on advertising, actually come under threat. Now, in this case, we would go to, for example, again, artificial intelligence, aka ChatGPT, and we would ask different questions and ChatGPT would conveniently say, here's the answer. Now, if you think about Google, Google was traditionally a search engine. You searched for something, it showed you a lot of blue links, basically, and that was it. But increasingly, Google is an answer engine. And Google, basically, within the space of really 2 years, as unassailable as they were, have had to pivot their entire business model. And you see that today. Go and use Google right now, and you will see that it is increasingly an answer engine, not a search engine. And I actually work with Google basically on disruption, basically out of the United States as well as their European teams. And increasingly, Google is doing a lot of really interesting things to try to, on the one hand, speed up their agility, but also, should we say, make themselves immune from disruptors who are increasingly teams of very small individuals who are using very advanced tools like AI to build new products faster, to scale faster and operationalize faster, and then get out into the market faster. When we think about MasterCard and when we think about Visa, companies like Amazon and Walmart basically have started building out their own stablecoin networks. Why? Because a stablecoin network doesn't require any commission fees. That's it. So we're seeing MasterCard and Visa being disrupted in lots and lots of different ways. And then when we think about Microsoft's unassailable position was generally granted to it by the fact that it would take me as an individual lifetimes, many lifetimes, basically to clone their software stack. So Microsoft has software, they have infrastructure in terms of Azure and cloud, and then they have their services and sort of consulting businesses. But if I said to you 5 years ago that we see a point in time where Microsoft can be cloned using artificial intelligence and we can do that quite quickly, again, you'd be saying, nope, not going to happen. And yet, about 3 months ago, Claude 4.6 from Anthropic cloned Microsoft Teams and Slack in 30 hours of continuous coding. Now, if we can clone Microsoft Teams in 30 hours of continuous coding today, then in the future that becomes 30 seconds. But it's not just Microsoft Teams, it's the entire Office suite. We're seeing this with Databricks, basically where AI agents are actually now standing up 80% of their databases and so on and so forth. So Microsoft is increasingly calling out an existential risk as we see the development of increasingly powerful agentic coding platforms and so on and so forth, like OpenAI Codex and Anthropic Claude. And we see this sort of same kind of disruption playing out, for example, with McKinsey, basically where AI can produce a McKinsey-style report now, as I've done a couple of times for a laugh, basically with my clients like KPMG and Ernst & Young, in 2 minutes. So when we think about disruption, increasingly there is a way to disrupt every single company on the planet. And just because I can clone your products, albeit in an IP-safe way, I then still have to be able to execute. And so increasingly, execution is the thing that sets people apart, and distribution basically is what keeps your moat at bay. So for example, when we talk about distribution, I can clone Microsoft today, but if I actually can't execute properly, if I don't have a distribution platform that lets me scale to 1 billion users, then it's going to be much more difficult for me to actually outmaneuver Microsoft in their key markets, even if I'm selling their products for free. So that was just a sort of little quick intro into disruption, and no one is safe. And there's lots of different examples I could bring up, but let's move on to blunders as standard. Now, when we actually look at Google Trends, so this is fresh off Google Trends, you can obviously see the top red line. There are more and more searches than ever before, and the trend line is increasingly sort of going up for people who are searching how to plan. Now, when we also look at people who are searching how to decide, we've seen a tenfold increase basically in the number of people who in an increasingly VUCA-MAX world are saying, I need help trying to figure out how to plan stuff, whether it's personal or whether it's for a business, and I need help being able to decide because we have lots of options and opinions coming our way. And so this is actually starting to cause a little bit of sort of what we call, should we say, decision procrastination or decision paralysis, where people are just saying, I've got too many options, too many things going on, it's all complicated, it's all confusing, I'm just not going to make a decision. Or I need help making a decision. Now, when we actually think about how this actually really translates basically into the boardrooms, we saw PwC basically came out with a report a little while ago. Basically, they went to 14,000 global executives of multinational companies in around 40 different countries. And 45% of those executives basically said that they felt that unless their businesses were transformed significantly sooner rather than later, then in 10 years' time, they thought that their businesses were going, and these are multi-billion-dollar businesses, by the way, they thought their businesses would be economically unviable. Now, that's another way of saying irrelevant, bankrupt, done. Now, when we actually think about corporate longevity with the S&P 500, it's a sort of popular stat. It used to be the case that if you were in the S&P 500, you'd be there for about 50 years in 1960. Now the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company is about 15 years, and over the next 10 to 15 years, we see that dropping to about 5 years for some of the disruption reasons I've mentioned. When we have a look at CEO tenures, the world is getting not only more complex, but actually there's a lot more that we're trying to sort of identify and see. But then on top of that, because everything's moving faster, increasingly it's difficult for CEOs to understand what's going on, to have conversations with their teams about what they should really be focusing on, and then actually executing the right strategies. And so we're seeing a 20% reduction in CEO tenures because, frankly, on the one hand, shareholders are increasingly saying, how come you didn't spot this? You know, for example, the development of agentic coding that just wiped over $1 trillion worth of market cap off different software companies like Workday, Salesforce, Microsoft, and so on and so forth. You have shareholders saying, how come you didn't see agentic coding coming for your business? And the fact of the matter is, I was talking about these trends 10 years ago. We do see them coming, but there's a difference between seeing a trend coming and then paying enough attention to it and then planning your response to it before it actually starts wiping out your market capitalization. Now, from a technology perspective, we've also seen $50 trillion worth of value destroyed by new emerging technologies. Now, for example, as we move from oil and gas, should we say, based economies to renewable energy economies, the $4 billion oil rig basically in the Gulf of America, if we want to call it that, might not actually have the same asset value as it used to. The giant Wolfsburg plant basically that is run by Volkswagen in Germany, that is specialized and brilliant at making cars with internal combustion engines. As we move and as we pivot a little bit more to hybrids and electric vehicles, it doesn't have the same asset value that it used to. So we're seeing the new emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence, wiping out value like never before. But the flip side of this is we think they're creating $250 trillion of new value, according to companies like ARK Invest. Now, in addition to that, basically when we see new administrations coming into the United States government, who shall remain nameless, within one day, the President of the United States actually signed 24 new executive orders and actually disrupted $33 trillion of global trade out of $35 trillion of global trade that was going on. That happened in pretty much a day. We've seen the impact of primary, secondary, tertiary, and sector tariffs basically on the global economy. And then in addition to that, when we actually think about the impact basically that different things are having on shareholder value, when DeepSeek was released, it wiped off $3 trillion worth of value basically from the United States S&P 500, but also the Indian stock exchange as well. It wiped $600 billion basically off the Indian stock exchanges. However, it also boosted the Hong Kong stock exchange by $1 trillion. So the release of DeepSeek within the space of really about 3 to 4 days swung global stock markets, which actually affect your pensions and so on and so forth, by over $3 trillion. These are the times that we're living in, and this is the slowest we are ever going to move. This is the least complex it's ever going to be. So from a board perspective, I typically think that most boards actually only see 30% of what I call the future. Now, what I mean by that is, yes, you'll see geopolitics. Yes, you'll be talking about the impact of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, metaverse, cryptocurrencies. You'll be talking about, supply chain risks, cybersecurity, whatever it happens to be. And I write and all of these are in my books. You're not seeing 70% of all of the other stuff. And I'm going to show you some of these that's going on. And increasingly, I suggest that it's not the 30% that'll kill you. It's the 70% of stuff that you don't see that'll cripple you. Now, what this ultimately means, basically, if you're only seeing 30% of the picture and you're missing 70% of the picture, then when you're putting your company strategy together, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to be wrong, or certainly that it's going to be misaligned with the markets that you care about. So I call this strategic drift. So you didn't see a new trend or something new emerging. Like, for example, the rise of robo-coding platforms if you're not necessarily Microsoft, but maybe if you're Salesforce. And so you didn't see it. And so when you're putting your strategic vision and plans together, you didn't plan for it. You've got no plan A, no plan B, no plan C, because you just don't have a plan for it because you haven't seen it. And I tend to argue basically that the more that you can see, the more you can get a point of view on. And whether or not you like it, once you see something, you can discuss it, you can debate it. And then you can either decide to embrace it, shelve it, or just ignore it. But that's your choice. If you don't see it, you can't plan for it. In addition to that, the vast majority of organizations typically will put together a 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe even a 10-year plan. But in a VUCA-MAX world, these 3 to 5 to 10-year plans simply just don't last. If you think about the advent of ChatGPT, which I saw in 2016 and have a YouTube video on that, when ChatGPT emerged in earnest really in 2022, no one's business plan survived contact with ChatGPT. So I continuously argue again, basically, that yes, you need a strategy, but you need to be able to modify that strategy every month, every week if you need to. It needs to increasingly be a dynamic strategy, a living strategy. And then once you redesign your strategy according to the new things that you're seeing, new market conditions, or whatever it happens to be, you also need to be able to execute against that strategy. And that's where a lot of organizations actually still struggle. Now, from a change perspective, I mentioned this earlier, consider this: we can change the planet in 69 milliseconds. So when GPT-5 was released, when GPT-6 is released, when Grok 4 was released, when Grok 5 will be released, when Claude 4 was released, when Claude 5 will be released. As soon as these foundational artificial intelligence companies press the publish button, 69 milliseconds later, everybody who is connected on the planet basically has access to whatever that AI can now do. The new capabilities, the new performance, the new levels of intelligence, the new knowledge basically that it has within its core self, etc., etc., etc. So AI, hyperconnectivity, our increasingly connected digital world, we can change lots. We can change almost how every business thinks, how every business runs, how every single person does their job in 69 milliseconds. And that's just for starters. Now, if the rate of change is accelerating, and all of the audiences that I work with around the world, when you ask them, is the pace of change today faster than it was 10 years ago? They all go, yes. And I say, if we fast forward 10 years, do you think the pace of change is going to be faster or slower than it is today? They also say faster. So if the pace of change is accelerating, then does that mean that your 5-year plan on the ground is actually a 3 or a 2-year plan? Your 10-year plan is a 5-year plan. So as the pace of change continues to accelerate, again, you need a dynamic strategy, but time compresses. And that gives you and your senior leadership teams another problem to solve, as if you didn't have enough already. So the culmination of all of this is ultimately all of these things that I've talked about make business, so execution, planning and strategy, as well as other things, much, much harder. And so you've got to work harder at trying to understand the future and everything that's going on as an SLT. And that means you've got to take more time out of your day to actually identify things that may matter, talk about them, discuss them, and then really sort of drill into them. Now, when it comes to silencing the noise, all of us get distracted by daily headlines, but let's look at how we silence the noise. So the first thing that you have to do as an organization is clarify your goals. When you're thinking about the future, what do you really care about? What do you really want to drill into? So for example, when we think about goals, do you want to understand new customer behavior, what new customer behaviors could look like in 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years time. So, do you want to know basically what your legal team might look like in 5 years time? Do you want to know how your individual employees in research and development might be using new tools to help you develop new products faster and cheaper? What's the timeline that you care about? So clarify your goals. What do you care about? What matters to you? But fundamentally, why do these things matter to you? Because a lot of people basically sort of will put a goal in place, and then when we say to them, but why does that thing really matter to you? They'll sort of go, I don't know. And see. So clarify your goals, figure out what really matters, what's important to you, but then figure out why is it important to you. So next, once you've clarified or framed your, should we say, foresight space, if we want to call it that, you have to be able to capture every signal that you can. You've got to be able to identify every new technology that's coming through, every new trend that's coming through, and then you need to be able to spot wildcards as quickly as possible. Now, the reason why I break it into technology and trends is because artificial intelligence is not a trend, it's a technology. But for example, it helps automate work. So the automation of work is the trend. They are very different. 3D printing is a technology, but 3D printing in manufacturing is the trend. Now, when we think about trends, there are really kind of two types of trends. Basically, you've got macro trends. Basically, these are like the tides. They are fundamentally unstoppable forces. So, for example, the bipolar world, digitization, sustainability, and others. Now, for example, as an individual SLT, are you really going to be able to influence the direction of the bipolar world? Are you going to be able to stop the rise of China or the attempted resurgence basically of the United States or the resurgence of Europe? Probably not. So when we actually think about the impact that you as individuals and teams can have on macro trends, these are the unstoppable forces. These are the forces that you just get carried along by. So if you are a rowboat basically in the Atlantic Ocean, you're going that way whether you like it or not. And you can put as much effort as you like into trying to go that way, but you're not going to actually stop it. Now, after macro trends, we then have micro trends. So within the context of Haribo, for example, these are the little vortexes, the eddies, basically, and the currents, basically, that as you near shore, determine whether or not you land on that part of the beach or that part of the beach, metaphorically. So, for example, the rise of nostalgic snacking or plant-based gummies. These are trends basically that as companies like Haribo, basically we can actually either play a role in or influence or help shape the future of. That's it. So this is sort of where I encourage senior leadership teams to spend more of their time thinking about. Think more about the micro trends that affect your industry or could affect your industry, because these are the ones that if you're a large organization, you're much more likely to be able to shape. And these are sort of more important basically to the consumer groups that you care about. Now, when we think about trends, there are hundreds. And these are them. So when I say I think senior leadership teams only see 30% of the future, how many of those trends did you actually recognize? Sustainability, yes, that's it. But the reducing cost of rocket launches, which increasingly allow us to launch low Earth orbit satellites basically into space to connect the other 3.5 billion people on the planet who today have very poor internet connections, that if you're Disney, basically all of a sudden increases your addressable market opportunity from 4.5 billion connected people to 8 billion connected people. How many trends do you know? How many technologies do you know? When we think about technologies, for example, this is my starburst. I track over 600 emerging technologies, and these are all in the codexes and the books that I write, so you can download them for free at the end. That's it, but there are 187 emerging technologies in 13 categories up to 50 years out on this particular starburst. Creative machines, which are actually generative artificial intelligences, I identified in 2016. So when we talk about being able to identify different technologies and trends early enough for us to have a point of view and to discuss whether they're an opportunity, a threat, or a response to them, that's it. If you have the right foresight, if you have the right information, if you have the right partners, then fundamentally you should never ever be at the point basically where you are disrupted. So for example, basically when we actually look at this, basically we have huge amounts of biotech innovation, we've got huge amounts of energy innovation. And I'm not going to go into this, but I've got A3 and A0 posters which you can download, and you can print those out, and then as a team you can mooch through them. But when we actually have a look at, robotics technologies, artificial intelligence. When it comes to artificial intelligence, we've already developed liquid and chemical and DNA neural networks. We are way beyond, quantum artificial intelligence, neuromorphic artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and just plain old ASI, artificial superintelligence. So there is a lot that we can discuss. So the point of all of this is, in 2, shall we say, slides, I'm hopefully showing you the 70%, or at least giving you an indication that you are missing a huge number of signals. And all of these generally either have a direct or an indirect impact on your business. So anyway, as we continue to try to eliminate noise, basically we've figured out what's important to us, why does it matter? We've identified lots of different signals, so technologies and trends. Once we've identified a signal, let's say, for example, a trend, does it matter to you? And if so, why? So once you've identified a trend, for example, you need to really work to understand its nature, its DNA. What is it? Why is it? What are the impacts of this particular trend? What are the first, second, and third degree impacts of this particular trend? What are the direct impacts? What are the indirect impacts of this trend? And I'm going to give you an example I gave to Haribo. So for example, when we have a look at a technology signal, genetic engineering. Genetic engineering allows us to breed and develop disease-resistant cows. Now, as Haribo, do we actually care about disease-resistant cows? Now, we kind of do, because, as a company, basically they rely on cows to a degree. That's it. So we want cows to thrive and be resilient, because that helps us maintain a consistent, low-risk supply chain, basically for example, gelatin. But do we care about disease-resistant cows when we're formulating our overall strategy? Maybe not so much. Now, when we took a look at 2 technologies, artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, which we're using to develop new proteins, which is the trend, do we care about new proteins as Haribo? Well, AI has created 200 million simulated proteins now, but maybe not. Maybe we're not too fussed. But what about this next one? What if we now use artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, which are the technology signals, and we can use that to create synthetic gelatin, which means we don't actually have to source any of our gelatin basically from cows any longer. This could help us reduce cost, reduce supply chain risk. This could actually help differentiate us in the marketplace. In fact, we could even turn this into a brand new revenue stream and actually sell synthetic gelatin to all of the other sort of candy manufacturers and FMCG companies. So when we're developing basically our medium sort of Horizon 2, Horizon 3 strategy, do we care about this? Absolutely. So this is why I say once you've identified a particular signal, you have to work very, very hard and look at it from lots and lots of different angles to truly understand whether or not it might have an impact basically on your business. And if so, what could that impact be? So now basically once we actually have figured out that synthetic gelatin basically might actually be a thing that we care about and be something that's actually possible, we have to establish its relevance. So how does it impact our costs, risk, or revenues? Now, for example, with synthetic gelatin, it might help us actually reduce costs, so input costs, because essentially it's a manufacturing process. It might help us reduce risks because actually we can create synthetic gelatin in a building in New York, so we don't need these expansive global supply chains basically that we have any longer. And then from a revenue perspective, well, actually, okay, it might not help us improve revenues, but if it's reduced our costs, then actually it's improving our margins. And if it improves our margins, then at some point, from a revenue perspective, it means that we could lower our prices if we see a new competitor coming into the market. So it allows us to be more flexible from a pricing perspective. Now, if this particular signal does actually impact any one of these three buckets, then you need to examine it further. What costs does it reduce? What risks does it reduce or raise? And what revenue impact does it actually have? If it doesn't impact any of these things in a meaningful way or in any way whatsoever, then you can disregard that signal. Now, from an impact perspective, now we've established that synthetic gelatin might actually have an interesting impact on cost and risk for the organization. What is the actual impact? Let's measure it. Is it a very big impact or is it a very small impact? If it's a big impact, we're probably going to care about it more than we do a small impact. But also, what's the probability? Because if it's a very high impact, but the likelihood that this new signal is going to actually have that impact, it's going to come to pass, is minute, then, okay, maybe we just keep an eye on it. Maybe we don't really do any actions yet. So this is where you need to be able to assess the impact of these different trends. You need the expertise within the room. You need people who understand these technologies, trends and signals, and then timing matters as well. Because if it's going to have a very high impact, but that high impact is in the year 2050, then it's not in our 5-year planning horizon. But if it's going to have a very high impact and that high impact starts tomorrow, then we now need to act with urgency. So when we think about, should we say, building out company visions and strategies that are relatively future resistant or future proof, it's not that difficult. But you have to start from a point of knowledge. And so when we think about all of these different trends, basically what we're really trying to analyze basically is the possibility that these signals are actually going to come to pass. We've also got to think, how are these signals, these technologies, trends, wildcards, how could they collide and converge with one another to create unexpected impacts? We've got to think about the timing, which is very, very difficult. So for example, with synthetic gelatin, if it costs $1 million per kilogram, we don't care about it. But actually, if it's cheaper than all of our alternatives and it's safe and reliable and the regulators allow it and so on and so forth, then actually the timing comes closer to us. And then trajectory. When we think about trends, especially, for example, are these trends actually upticking or are they starting to fade into irrelevance? So if we think about the bipolar world, for example, that is a trend that is upticking dramatically. So these are some of the simple things that your teams can do to really just try to understand the nature of these different trends, their impact, when they're going to have an impact, and their overall likelihood of coming to pass. Now, another simple example basically is electric vehicle fleets. Now, from a company perspective, I do a lot of work with companies like Lego as well as fleet operators basically throughout Europe. And great, I've got an electric truck. I've got an electric car. That's great. I give my employees basically an EV. However, these EVs are packed full of lithium-ion batteries. So when I actually plug these back in at the depot, I can actually take electricity that is stored basically in the car or the vehicle, and I can feed it back to the grid. Now, when the grid needs extra energy. Now, in that particular case, for a standard truck, we think that as a revenue opportunity represents an opportunity of at least £1,250 per year. So when you actually have a look at the rise of some of these new trends and technologies, what are the things that you're not seeing? How could you use them to reduce costs, reduce risks, and or increase revenues and help you break into new markets and opportunities? And so, for example, if you look at Tesla and BYD, Tesla is now selling electricity directly to consumers. When you have a look at BYD is teamed up with Octopus in the UK to sell electricity directly to consumers, because increasingly I buy an electric vehicle, but I also buy the electricity from my house from the same company that sold me or made my electric vehicle. So the future is multi-dimensional, shall we say. Not everything is obvious. And when we think about AI agents, for example, increasingly we see more and more organizations like Google, who I'm working with at the moment, actually starting to use AI agents to identify the tasks and jobs to be done within an organization and then divvy out those jobs and tasks to be done to human employees. So on the one hand, we've got AI agents now that are both employees within the organization that are being managed by the CHRO and the HR office, but also we also see a point where AI agents are actually becoming essentially agentic managers. Now, have you thought of that? How does that affect your vision, your strategy within the HR team or operations and so on and so forth? And then basically when we think about digital, every single one of my customers is going through a digital transformation program. They have really for the past 20 years, and they still go through digital transformation programs. But if you're embedding AI within your business, which is a technology that takes information in, analyzes that information, and then you give it the ability to make decisions and act on your behalf, then are you undertaking a digital transformation or an intelligence transformation? Because if you're undergoing an intelligence transformation, which most companies are actually undertaking today, then your partners are different. Your technology stack, your IT, OT stack is different. That's it. Your investments are different. Your workflows are different. Your workforce is different, and so on and so forth. And then increasingly organizations are moving from being automated, so robotic process automation, for example, to becoming autonomous organizations. So we talk about automated supply chains moving to autonomous supply chains, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of where expertise and different points of view really matter when it actually comes basically to not just understanding what signals are arriving, but how they might impact an organization in unexpected ways. And then once we've sort of figured all of this out, if we've identified a new signal that has a high impact and it's likely to arrive sooner rather than later, does this new signal that you've seen, does it change your priorities at a personal level, a team level, an organizational level? And if the answer is yes, then do you park it or do you act? Now, realistically, if you have a signal basically that is high impact and it's going to arrive sooner rather than later, and then it's highly likely that you should probably act on it, not park it. But the vast majority of organizations, if you don't see this stuff in the first place, you never get to choose whether you should park this new thing or whether you should act on it. And then, of course, when it comes to acting on it, That's a case of, well, what do we do? Now, when we think about wildcards, and there are lots of wildcards, this is the playbook. So firstly, when it comes to wildcards, there will be more and more wildcards coming out in the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. We know this. We don't necessarily know what they are, the black swan events. So firstly, as an organization, you have to remain vigilant. You've got to try to see as much as you can. You've kind of got to be as aware of the world around you as you can. And that's difficult, but you've got to maintain vigilance. Now, recently we saw Manduro, Taiwan, basically keeps getting talked about as a possible invasion point and flashpoint. We saw the war in Ukraine. When a new wild card comes up, do we care? So, for example, if Taiwan basically is invaded, do we care? Well, actually, if Taiwan is invaded or surrounded, basically, then we're going to see a global semiconductor shortage. So yes, it does matter if you're a company like, for example, Audi or Ford. So if that does matter, then okay, what are we going to do about it? Now we've got the knee-jerk reaction of, okay, Taiwan has been surrounded, what do we do now? Bugger, our supply chain just collapsed. But what's our plan to maintain resilience in this particular situation? When Ukraine was invaded, we saw liquid natural gas prices spike by 244%. So did the invasion of Ukraine matter? Yes, because it spiked our energy prices, which actually made our factories very, very uneconomic to run. So, and this is the thing. So again, remain vigilant, identify the wild card as quickly as you can, and then figure out, does it matter? But does it matter to you, and why does it matter to you? And then how do you react? So once you've identified these wild cards, you need to be able to identify their impact quickly. Have you got a team in the company that could do that quickly, where you could just call them in right now, have a very quick, half an hour, 1 hour get together, and then understand the impact of this new wild card on your business? Secondly, run scenarios, the what ifs. Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And then we assign probabilities to all of them. And then build out options. Option if this happens, options if this happens, options if this happens. So see, analyze, and move at speed. That's it. This is your foundational way of dealing with wildcards, any kind of wildcard, basically, however it emerges. Tariffs is a good one. That's it. When I actually gave this presentation, it was a Thursday, basically. Then we saw new tariffs basically being threatened on the European Union on Saturday over Greenland. And all of a sudden, companies on Monday basically were in a tiz, basically wondering what the impact of these new tariffs were going to have basically on their export businesses. Now, when we think about seeking certainty in uncertain times, well, we can do that. Now, one of the ways that we actually do that basically is we follow the trend lines, not the headlines. So, for example, and let me get rid of that call. Follow the trend lines, not the headlines. Don't react. Choose to respond. So something has happened. Take your time. Think about how you would respond to it. Don't just do a knee-jerk reaction. And then there's the anchoring constants theory, which was developed by the 311 Institute. And I'm going to explain this. So the anchoring constants theory basically is what we try to do is we try to identify the innate behaviors of systems that are always true under almost all circumstances that persist across time. So for example, when we think about companies today care about profit. Companies in 100 years' time also will likely care about profit. However, how they generate that profit, whether it's using humans or AI, whatever it happens to be, how they generate that profit will change. And that's where we then go into looking at signals. So for example, when we have a look at economic trends, the constants, when governments basically are thinking about their own economies. Firstly, they will always care about the balance of trade. We see this exactly happening in the United States, but also in Malaysia, in Europe, and so on and so forth, as well as China. They will always care about economic growth. They will always care about price stability, which is why so many central banks fight hard to get inflation basically under control. They will also care about productivity, so workforce productivity, whether that is AI augmented, or human productivity. And then companies, as I said, will always care about profitability. So these are the things that will always be true, by and large. How we maintain the right balance of trade, well, that's the headline, and that's tariffs, that is currency, exchange rates, and not necessarily saying manipulation, but we can go there as well. So these are the things that will always be true. Now, when we think about environmental trends, for example, the environment, basically irrespective of how much carbon dioxide we throw into the Earth's atmosphere and everything else, the Earth's environment will always seek a state of equilibrium. The Earth's environment and ecosystem is interdependent. It will always will be. And natural selection basically will always matter. So in 100 years' time, animals basically will still be going through the natural selection process, even if the seas are now boiling. When we think about geopolitics, which is sort of one of the hottest, should we say, hot potatoes basically of the moment, for obvious reasons, politicians will always seek to generally maintain control. Ego and power will always play into political decisions, especially basically when we think about political parties and world leaders. World leaders will also always care about GDP growth. So in the United States, we expect GDP growth this year to be in the 5 to 6% range. In Europe, basically, we have 18 of the G20 economies basically that have GDP growth below 2%. And so in Europe, for example, one of the big conversations is how do we actually improve GDP growth? So guess what? All of the policies and headlines basically that they sort of come out with as governments will generally be to try to stimulate GDP growth. We might not know what the headlines are or the policies are exactly, but the North Star is GDP growth. Governments will also care about national security. This is driving a lot of the decisions in the United States at the moment, and politicians will always care about political survival, which is actually why we see the rise of populism, for example, and short-term thinking, not long-term thinking. So everything kind of makes sense when you start thinking about the future in terms of constants. And then when we think about societal needs and trends, in 100 years' time, humans basically will still have basic needs. Food, water, shelter. We are always going to want convenience. If I said to you in the future, would you rather things were much more inconvenient in the future or more convenient in the future, then as a consumer, you're probably going to say, I'd like things to be more convenient. How it becomes convenient, that might be agentic commerce or a new AI sort of interface or whatever it happens to be, or AI buying your products for you or vetting your products for you, whatever it happens to be. We're generally always going to be, hopefully, caring about ethics and trust. Trust is always going to be a central tenet of why consumers buy from a particular business or do work with a particular business. So at the 311 Institute, for example, if you don't fundamentally trust our organization or me, then why are you going to use us? And then value. When we think about value, in the future, you are going to care about value, fair value. If I was charging £1 million for my services, then you're not going to use me because it's not realistic, fair value unless you can't get what I'm doing anywhere else. So again, when we think about societal constants, these are the societal constants that remain true under almost all conditions. And irrespective, basically, of your political leanings or biases or backgrounds and so on and so forth. And when we think about technology, increasingly technologies like artificial intelligence are going to have their own agency. We already see this with AI agents basically that are increasingly acting autonomously and doing all sorts of weird things. That's a different conversation. In the future, we are more likely to automate more rather than less. The cost performance of technology is going to actually improve. So, for example, in the future, we're going to be able to buy into more powerful artificial intelligences that do more for less. Technology is also going to be more pervasive. Do you think that in the future we're going to be using more technology in more places or less? It's going to be more. And then utility. The utility of the technologies that we actually use is going to improve. These are the constants. These are the North Stars. This is how we accurately predict, within reason, with caveats, this is how we predict the Horizon 2, Horizon 3 futures. The things basically that will happen 10 years or more out. And this is the work that I do every single day. This is also why, for example, basically when I first identified generative artificial intelligence in 2016 and talked about it in London, this is why ultimately I always knew that that personal assistants, which become AI agents, and generative artificial intelligence, which I used to call creative machines, they would automate more and more stuff, so they would have more and more of an impact. It's simple when you understand constants. And then finally, when we actually have a look at leadership, we've been through how we actually see the future, think about the future, and then kind of write it into our strategies. From a leadership perspective, I increasingly argue that speed is your biggest issue. The world is changing faster and faster and faster in more complex ways that are increasingly difficult to actually predict. That's it. And so speed is your issue. When GPT-6 is released, for example, maybe later this year, and it's available to everyone on the planet, basically with an internet connection 69 milliseconds later, how are you going to react? How are you going to transform the ICT stack of your business? How are you going to transform your business models, your product development, all these kinds of different things, but also do it faster than your competitors? Speed of decision making, speed of execution, speed of integration. These are all challenges you have today, and they're only going to get more extreme in the future. Now, when we think about the amount of control that the average CEO has of their organization, only 45% of what happens to your organization is directly controlled by you and the CEO. 55% of what happens to your organization happens from external trends and external factors. For example, OpenAI releases a new artificial intelligence. The US administration implements new tariffs. The Chinese government implements trade exclusions basically on rare earth metals. ESG, new policies from Europe about plastic. These are all things basically that happen externally to your organization, but actually have an impact on your organization. You only control 45%. And if you only controlled 45% of a traditional company, you aren't the majority shareholder. So, ironically, external forces are in more control of your company than you are as a senior leadership team or as a board. So, as individuals, basically, you need to be insanely curious. You've got to be really open-minded. I've shown you just a couple of examples here of basically why you should be open-minded. But science fiction is increasingly science fact. We're doing all sorts of different things that previously were unimaginable, such as using a single artificial intelligence to disrupt Microsoft, or a single AI agent to help us build a team of agents that I, as an individual entrepreneur, basically can use to create a multi-billion-dollar software company overnight. You've also got to be trustworthy. When you communicate all of this basically internally to your own employees and you cascade it through the organization, people within your company have to be able to trust you. You need an open culture of innovation and trust. But you've also got to unlearn, because the way that the future behaves is not how the past behaved. The rules that governed us in the past increasingly no longer apply to the future. So unlearn almost everything. Not quite everything, but almost everything. You also have to challenge every single assumption that your organization has ever made. Because the vast majority of organizations keep doing what they do because they've always done it that way. This is where the process of exnovation actually comes into play, because exnovation is the process by which you actually look at every single thing that's going on within your organization, and if it isn't adding a huge amount of value or any value at all, why are you doing it? So challenge all assumptions and undergo a process of exnovation and cut out the dead wood, whatever it happens to be and however painful it happens to be. Because if something isn't fundamentally providing or adding value to your organization today and in the future, why are you spending time, effort, and resources on it? Now, when we think about resilience, especially, as we see all of these different changes actually coming through, a lot of these are mind-bending. 1 in 6 people globally now have a mental health issue of one form or another, according to the latest statistics. As leaders, you need to take your time. You have individuals like me that can show you all of these different signals, and we can walk through what they are, what their impact on your company might be. But fundamentally, you need to be able to take your time, because as humans, we aren't processing information as fast as artificial intelligence is. And your mental health matters. There are more people, more CEOs, as I alluded to earlier, that are actually burning out and struggling basically just with today's realities, let alone tomorrow's. As a board, as an SLT, I would argue basically that it's your role basically to try to limit surprise. That's it. You are ultimately going to get into trouble with shareholders, with consumers, basically if there are things that surprise you that you didn't actually account for. So by trying to cast the net as far and wide as you can, to identify as many signals as you can, ultimately what you're really doing is you're limiting the likelihood that you're going to get surprised and therefore disrupted in the future. Also stretch your time horizon, because if the future is coming at you faster, then you need to be looking further out. Horizon 2, Horizon 3. So as I say, in 2016, I saw the first generative artificial intelligence signal. It was a text to video from Stanford University. And I knew at that point that as soon as you could do text or input to output, that others would start latching on to that, and eventually it would be text to video, text to image, text to report, text to code, text to whatever, text to virtual reality asset, text to 3D asset, voice to 3D asset, etc., etc. The future is broadly predictable, with caveats. I'm always going to say with caveats. So stretch your time horizon. Look not just at Horizon 1, but spend more time in Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. And that's exactly what I do with companies like Pepsi. We actually spend more time looking at Horizon 3 than we do at Horizon 1, Horizon 2. Now, when we have a look at most organizations, the vast majority of traditional organizations do this. They spend 85% of their time in Horizon 1, the near sort of future. 10% in Horizon 2, which are sort of 1 to 3 years, and then 5% in Horizon 3, which we could kind of argue is kind of like 5 to 20, but we can change the timelines as we like. However, when we actually have a look at some of the world's leading organizations, like, for example, Google, like Amazon, like Pepsi as well, basically in the FMCG space and so on and so forth, and as well as Haribo, most of those organizations actually spend, Huawei and Samsung are another good example of this, ARM, etc. Those organizations spend about 60% of their time thinking about Horizon 1, the present day and the very near future. They spend 25% of their time in Horizon 2 and 15% of their time in Horizon 3. So if the future is coming at you faster and faster and faster, you can see that spending more time looking at Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 possibilities and opportunities actually means that you are limiting surprise. But you're also buying yourself time to see something emerging, talk about it, figure out if it's important to you or not and the impact of it, and then decide whether or not, or decide how that's going to should we say, change your priorities and maybe change your strategy. So this is where, rather than having the future done to you, you can actually shape the future to your advantage. And then decisions. Now, when we actually have a look at decisions, when we as individuals are buying a house, we make 60 large decisions. However, when companies are building their own strategies or building a new strategy or strategic vision, did you know they make 11,000 decisions? And I've actually got another presentation on how to accelerate decision making and everything else. So I'll put the links in below. I do lots of stuff. So when we're making a new strategic vision for the company, typically that involves 11,000 decisions, and 500 of those are big decisions. That's it. So this comes basically from companies like Harvard and everything else who've done studies into this area. So if any of these big decisions are misguided, misplaced, if the information you're using isn't accurate, isn't full or thorough, then this is where we end up potentially getting much more strategic drift, as I mentioned earlier. And also, as the future changes faster and faster, as it's increasingly ambiguous and chaotic and complex and all these kinds of different things, the fact of the matter is, as leadership teams, we're going to have to try to actually make decisions when we don't actually have all of the information that we need. So we're going to end up having to actually try to decide when we have imperfect information and when things are ambiguous. You know, this is typically where we start using our gut. Now, from that perspective, you know, when we think about making decisions, should we say, in a vacuum, without all of the information that we want or feel we need, this is what we should do. So find the fundamental truth. Don't assume anything. Now, also focus on the facts that you do have. That's it, that drive the majority of the results. Basically, when you're trying to decide, you know, do we do this or do we do that? You know, focus on the facts that drive most of the results. But then also make low risk, easy to reverse decisions. That's it, because if you do get things wrong, and you will get things wrong, you don't want to have got the wrong things hardwired and hard-coded into your organization so much, basically, that you can't actually unwind them quite quickly. And then when we think about growth, ambition matters. There are so many organizations that think, tomorrow, basically, I want to grow the company by 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. Ambition matters. Raise your risk appetite, and I'm going to give you some examples. So Elon Musk, for example, basically his ambition is to use humanoid robotics to automate all human labor. It's a $25 trillion market opportunity. When we actually think about Elon Musk again, he wants to automate all mobility, basically with his robo-taxis. That is a $5 trillion market opportunity that many think could actually send Tesla basically into the $2 trillion market cap space. When we think about Sam Altman and OpenAI, they want to automate all cognitive work. Now, this is an artificial general intelligence sort of definition that they actually have. When you think about your own ambitions, if your own ambition is to grow your company by 5% next year, guess what? You might hit 5%. And you just do what you did last year, 5% more. However, if you say next year we want to grow the business by 100%, then you fundamentally can't do what you did last year. You have to fundamentally rethink your products, your market strategy. Do you actually do M&A? All these kinds of different things. So if your ambition is incremental, then you're only ever going to grow incrementally. If your ambition is grand, these grand visions that we see, then yes, they might take more effort, more resources, more time, but fundamentally, for example, Elon Musk gets humanoid robots right. He has a slice of a $25 trillion market. That's it. And you are the customer. And as I said earlier at the beginning, every threat to you is an opportunity. The future is a mindset. If you see everything as a threat, you're going to go and hide in your company's basement. If you see it as an opportunity, then you're going to think, what is this opportunity? Why does it matter? to us. What do we do about it? And then you're going to talk about it. Then you're going to bake that into your strategic vision, hopefully. And that's it from me. Now, if you want to download my 15 codexes, basically there are about 12,000 pages of futures insights like the Trends Codex and the Starburst, the technology Starburst that I showed earlier, then just click this QR code or scan this QR code and you'll go to the 311institute.com website and you can download everything for free. And in the meantime, I know basically that this has been a long video. Hopefully it's been worth it because I really care about sharing these kinds of insights. But more than that, what I wanted to try to do is I wanted to show you how all of these things actually connect with one another. So rather than just doing a single siloed short video on, Foresight, for example, basically, or trend spotting or whatever it happens to be, I want to sort of bring all of this big picture to you. So if you like this video, comment, like it, etc., down below. And I hope you all have a great future. All the best and thank you for watching. Take care and goodbye.